when I first started out my career with ICE, like my office I was assigned to was attached to a detention center. And so that's kind of like a parallel court system almost. It's all immigration related, but people are detained. You have a classification system. We had like 3,000 detainees or inmates, but detainees just going through their immigration process. And as those guys are, going through that process, like you can get down to like pretty much like, I know how to ask the things I need to ask and understand the things I need to understand to get this person where they need to go. And I tell a guy, like, line up, put your hands up, do X, Y, and Z. But they're picking up English along the way too. So it's so funny how you get into those like conversations with people where neither of you speak each other's language, but you're like really able to kind of point and grunt your way through it. And you pick up so much more in that natural environment, I think, from people like that. But that's jailhouse Spanish, man. It's like they'll learn like the dirty words first, right? And so it's like you're like what are these guys teaching me? Like and of course the English that they're picking up, it's the dirty words first. So I mean that's just how.
Yeah, they teach you what not to say. Normally, if a Spanish guy in prison is saying, "Hey, go say this to someone,"
do it.
Yeah, do not do that.
Yeah,
they take advantage of the white guys that don't speak any other language.
I didn't spend a lot of time in like I know you were in like a BOP. I don't know which one you were in.
I was all over.
You were all over.
Yeah, I was in Brooklyn. I was in a lot of detention centers too, and I was in a private facility in Rhode Island that also housed ICE.
Who ran that? Was it
it was just a private subcontractor. Okay. It was called the Wyatt Detention Center.
Okay.
And they were structured completely different, like with the chain of command. Like they had a major, they had a captain, they had a lieutenant and a sergeant, whereas the BOP just goes, I think, sergeant, lieutenant, captain. Yeah. They don't even have a major or anything
You've got like assistant wardens and wardens, all that stuff. The place that my office was at, it was a private facility. It was run by MTC, which is Management and Training Corporation. They had like a $4 million a month contract with Willacy County, Texas. And, we would classify people that would come in. Like my job, like I signed up expecting, because this is like right after 9/11, and it's like, come fight terrorism. And that was like the whole appeal to me to go into law enforcement. I was going to be an archaeologist. I had my degree and all that stuff. I was working in the field, had gotten into grad school, and then 9/11 happens. And I was like, all right, maybe I want to go do that, because these guys who attacked us were all overstayed. They had like overstayed visas, right? So they were all people who were in the country who hadn't been rounded up. They were able to do this crime. And I was like, I want to be part of catching the next group of those people. And so I get there's a lot of patriotism at the time. Everybody's like, yeah, like let me come and join the military, join law enforcement, whatever. And these guys call me up and they're like, hey, like we got a job for you. After I'd applied for Border Patrol, CBP, I'm in like the process for all of them. And they're like, it's this place called Raymondville, Texas. And I've never heard of it. I'm like, all right, I'm in like Portland, Maine. I'm like, all right, I know where Raymondville, Texas is. Can you tell me? And the HR rep is like, yeah, it's like just a little bit south of Corpus Christi. And I hadn't been to Corpus Christi, but I knew it was a good-sized town. I was like, okay, Corpus Christi's on the bay. So they got beaches, they got water. It's probably warm weather. That sounds all right. Let's go do that. And this is like before like we had like smartphones, right? This is like you get on like MapQuest to like figure out how to get there. And like I looked it up. I started doing like my research, and I was like, this is like 2.5 hours south of Corpus Christi. This is like not like a suburb of Corpus Christi is what was like billed to me. And so it was like an hour from the border. Like if you think of where South Padre Island is. That's like Brownsville, Texas, and that's like right on the border with Mexico. And so I was like officed a little bit inland from that, and they rented they contracted this facility through Willacy County, and at the time we just had so many people coming across, not like that the drop in the bucket compared to what we've got going on now, but we had so many people coming across that they needed to build all these like privately contracted facilities because the federal government couldn't keep up with the amount of people that they had to detain. And it was a debacle from the start. I mean, like you said, you're in some private places. Like it's a completely different environment when you're not in. Like they're on a contract, so they have to have ICE detention standards maintained. Like they have to keep up with certain standards, but there's not ICE people in house, and they're not an accredited like jail facility, so they don't have like that accreditation, and they're not keeping up with some of the other standards that are like more commonplace with Bureau of Prisons. And there was a lot of stuff that was just a hot mess there. And they built the place quickly, staffed it up quickly. And the town that it was placed in, there was a marshal's facility there. So like, pre-trial stuff. And it was also a contract facility. There was a state facility there that was a contract facility. And then there was the county jail there. They were all on the same road. So all of the people in this small town that were looking for a job had already probably been picked up if they were like high quality staff. They'd already been picked up by these other jails that had been there for a while. And what ended up happening is a lot of the guys who came in, like it was sometimes hard to tell. like we used to joke, you had all these level ones, which was in the immigration classification system, no criminal history. Your only crime is, crossing the border. You got to go through the court process, and then you're going to get deported. You're going to get, sent back to Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, wherever. Those guys got blue uniforms. The next guys in line got orange uniforms. Those were level 2s, typically nonviolent crimes. And then your level 3s were the guys who were aggravated felons, guys who had done like higher levels. So mostly like narcotics trafficking stuff, drug crimes, sex crimes, things like that. And we were mostly, about 2,000 of our guys were like level 1. They were just in and out quickly. We arrested them, put them through immigration court process. They got deported. A lot of them, they came back. Like we'd see the same guys again and again and again. But we used to joke that we had level 3s guarding level 1s at this place, because the guys who were like it was like the last draft pick, getting put into this guard position. And so right from the start, there was contraband coming in. There was just like people smuggling cell phones and dope. And you name it, it was coming in. And these guys were not getting the thorough background checks they were supposed to. They're supposed to have full 10-year scope background checks because they're federal government contractors. They built this place and got it up off the ground so quickly that they kind of skipped all that. So they just put these guys in there. And it was like legit. Like when they started doing the background checks about a year into it, I'd say about 25, 30% of the workforce either quit or failed their background checks. So out of 800 contractors who were guarding 3,000 people, we had a failure rate of about 1 in 4 that couldn't pass the background check. And they had been guarding these people for a year and a half, 2 years at that point.
Did your opinion of the government and law enforcement change after you get in and you see all of this? As an American, you're like, wow, what's going on? This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's something you've always wanted to learn? As adults, we often get caught up in life and forget to make time for new experiences, unlike when we were kids, constantly learning and exploring. Whether it's picking up gardening, mastering a new language, or finally beating your friend at bowling, therapy can help you tap back into that curiosity. Your back-to-school phase doesn't have to be limited to childhood. It can happen at any age. Now, therapy has been a huge part of my journey after getting out of prison. It gives me the space to really process everything I went through, helped me understand myself better, and made me more aware of how I handle challenges. It's been a way to work through my past, build healthier habits, and focus on moving forward. Without therapy, I don't think I would have had the same level of growth or perspective that I have today. It's played a major role in helping me rebuild my life, and if you're on the fence about it, I encourage you to give it a try. It might just change your life like it did for mine. If you're considering starting therapy, BetterHelp might be a great option for you. It's all online, making it super convenient and flexible to fit into your schedule. You just need to complete a short questionnaire, and they'll match you with a licensed therapist. Plus, if you ever feel like switching therapists, you can do so at no extra cost. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedin today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedin. Thanks to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's episode.
I joined for the purest of reasons, right? A lot of people post 9/11 were like I want to go and serve in some capacity. And so, again, it was the whole idea of let's go and fight terrorism was very appealing. And that was how DHS, they had just stood up this whole new department. The whole idea was to, combine all these agencies that had been disparate and across the federal government, put them all together under one single umbrella and be more effective at cross-border crime, basically. Anything that was threatening us by crossing a border. So they brought in, customs came from the Treasury Department, immigration came from Department of Justice, and they all kind of ended up mashed together. And so I thought a lot of people who are going to be working there were going to have that same attitude, that gung-ho, let's make sure we stop the next 9/11. And there were a fair amount of them. That whole Generation 9/12 mentality definitely existed. But there were also a lot of guys I wasn't expecting, and just a lot of guys who were just classic kind of what you think of when you think of the government employee, the person at the DMV who's not it takes an act of Congress to fire them, so they're not really highly motivated, and they're just kind of getting those paychecks every 2 weeks and just And that sort of disappointed me, and that continued to disappoint me throughout my career, because you run into those people at every level as you are advancing in your career. But I was definitely not expecting the amount of corruption that I ran into, and that, like, in a place like the Rio Grande Valley where I was working, and you've got the Gulf Cartel just on the other side of the river. They pay a lot better than we do, you know. Like you get paid pretty well as a government employee, as a special agent, as a border patrol agent, as a customs officer. Like they do well. Most of those guys make six figures, but and it depends on location and all that stuff. Most of them make six figures when they journey out. But the cartel has just deeper pockets. And like if you were somebody who was going through a divorce, or you had like a bankruptcy, or you're dealing with some problems, there was a lot of opportunity for people to get corrupted, to start down that slippery slope, to have those issues get exploited by the people on the Mexican side of the river. And I saw a ton of it. And that was like, it started when I started working at that detention center. You started seeing that. A lot of that contraband coming in was because we had these level 3 like guys who were picked up, who were at Rikers Island, ICE agents. Like they have an office on like Varick Street in downtown New York. And they would go out to Rikers and they would interview inmates there. And, you know, they would find out if somebody had, you know, was a foreign national, right? And they would check, and there's classification system to see, okay, this person has status, but he's committed 2 felonies, so he's going to go into immigration court to determine whether he can be deported, or this guy has no status. And a lot of times what would happen is, and I'm using Rikers as an example because these people are coming from all over, a lot of times what would happen is a state wouldn't want to hold on to somebody. Like if they've got somebody in their custody who they've arrested for simple assault or whatever, and he's in custody, he's got a long criminal record, they know, hey, I'm going to prosecute this guy. That's going to cost us money. I'm going to detain this guy while I'm prosecuting him. I'm going to then jail him after, you know, he's sentenced. So we're going to have all of this bill. Or this guy doesn't even belong in the country, and ICE has placed a detainer on him. They've interviewed him. They've determined he doesn't want to, or he doesn't belong here. We're going to turn him over to ICE when he's done anyway, because we've got a court-ordered detainer. So why would we run him through this process? Why would we keep him in jail for 2 or 3 years at the cost of our taxpayers when we can turn him over to the federal government, and they're just going to kick him back to Colombia or, you know, Venezuela, Nicaragua, wherever he came from? And so we would get a lot of those guys coming in from like places like New York City. And these are guys who like have been running the streets for a long time. They are like a different breed of criminal than like what you're seeing down in like small town deep South Texas. And these guards were like just getting like turned left and right, because these guys were like smooth talkers, and they were like, hey man, like, you know, my family back in New York wants to give me some cash, wants to give me this, wants to give me that. Can you like help me out? And these guys would just be like lining up for it. So, yeah. So, long story short, like, yeah, that corruption was shocking to me. Seeing all these guys who were, you know, making what was decent money at the time, working in that capacity, just being like tempted with, you know, like, can you bring this in? And, you know, my girl's going to, you know, send her cousin down here. He's going to meet you in a parking lot at the Home Depot and, you know, pay cash. And if you bring this in, whatever. And that was happening all the time. And that was like basically the mechanism that got me into internal affairs. Was I recognized and understood that this was happening. I had some sources in that facility that brought information to me about this network of guards that were bringing stuff in, and I brought it to the local internal affairs office and worked with some of the snitches in the detention center to like identify the network and take it down. And we found, I mean, the amount of contraband coming in. I don't know what you saw in BOP. They're a much more professional organization.
There's still insane amounts, and it comes from guards.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
A guard could bring in a cell phone and make, you know, $5,000 for a bundle of cell phones.
Exactly.
And they're probably paid less than Border Patrol. Oh,
for sure. Yeah, I don't know what those guys are like, their GS level is, but I think they probably, most of them maybe are GS 7 or 9. Border Patrol guys are like GS 13s, in some cases 12s and 13s. So they're making, you know, 6 figures. BOP guys probably not. I mean, management, yes. But yeah, it's exactly that. I mean, there's just a powerful incentive for them to bring stuff in. And it was very easy in a contract facility like that with looser standards, where you had lower quality employees, and it was nuts. I mean, we had, as soon as we started bringing in level 3 people from around the country, people from like Chicago, people from New York, the guards were just like turning left and right. And so it got to the point where like you couldn't trust. You didn't know who you could trust, right? That like, I'm going to go in here and, I'm talking to this detainee about something, or I've got whatever going on. Like, if I'm trying to get intel from this guy, I don't know what guards are around that are watching and seeing. Like, it was a very tough environment to work in, because you didn't trust the people that you were talking to who were detainees. You didn't trust the guards. You didn't know who was working with whom. We had female guards having sex with detainees in like broom closets. I mean, there was like crazy amounts of nonsense. And this place, it's no longer open, which is a good thing. But it lasted, I think, from about 2006 until maybe 2010 or 11 or so. So it was about 5 years that this place had this contract with ICE. And at the end of this contract, things had been so bad there. There ended up being a riot, and they burned a bunch of. This was like they call them sprung structures. They're like the tents, like the circus tents. And you got like 50 people in there, and the group showers and group toilets, and like all bunk beds, single tiny little television up in the corner, one guard watching all of them, and then you've got like just like a little like the outdoor area. I mean, it's deep South Texas, so in the summertime you're like out on like just like a like blazing hot like blacktop. I mean, I understand why there was a riot. But at the end of it, there ended up being a riot, and they had to call in people from all the different agencies to quell the riot. And then after that, they were like, we're done. They shut the place down. But I was there for about 2.5, 3 years working in that environment. And man, I've been in jails around the world. I've been to prison in Singapore. I've been in other countries as well. I've never seen a place that was more poorly run than an immigration detention center in deep South Texas.
What was the training like to become an agent? Is it like the counterparts of the feds and law enforcement in general?
Yeah. So for me, I went to 2 different academies federally. So I went when I got initially hired by ICE. They sent me down to Georgia, which is the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And everybody goes there except for FBI and DEA and the postal inspectors. They have FBI and DEA have Quantico. The postal inspectors have their own academy. Everybody else goes to FLETC. And that's like everyone from like Bureau of Prisons guys go there. TSA guys go there now. So they do all the different academies there. And then for me, it was basic immigration law enforcement. So you learn all the law, you learn Fourth Amendment, you learn Fifth Amendment, you learn all the constitutional law, then all the immigration law, you learn how to do the job, how to drive, how to arrest somebody, court process, all of that stuff. It's about I don't know if it's the same now, this is a while ago, but it was about a 3.5 month long academy. And then I went back a couple of years later when I got hired as a special agent. I went back to an advanced school that's called Criminal Investigator Training Program. And that is like to become a special agent. And that's the same basic course of instruction that if you meet someone who's a special agent from any organization, they probably went through that program that I went through. So it's about the same. And then my agency had an add-on program beyond that. So it was like an additional like 3 or 4 weeks of training for agency-specific tasks. But some agencies, they might go to FLETC, like, Secret Service has been in the news the last couple of days, right? They have a 3-month academy that they go through. This is the same thing I went through. And then they go and have this advanced school where they learn all the protective stuff and all the, shooting and all the other stuff that most people don't learn. So it depends on the agency. Most, I would say, like if you don't mind me asking, like who worked your case? Like what was your? So
it was the very first one was local, and then that got escalated. But then the ones that picked it up was the postal inspectors, and I had no idea that we had postal inspectors. Yeah. And then I went to the FBI, IRS, and from there.
So postal inspectors, they have their own academy. I've been to their academy and have done some training there. It's in it's like in Potomac, Maryland, or something like that. It's actually beautiful. They've got like a great academy. I would have loved to have gone there. But IRS, they go to the same place I went. And so if your like IRS agent ever interviewed you, he had the same exact training I had. And then he would have had some sort of add-on academy to learn additional stuff that's specific to their agency. So it's all pretty much the same. FBI, they do their own thing because they're kind of their own. They have their own language. They do their own thing. But it's all the same job. If you're a special agent at FBI or IRS or DHS, it's the same classification, same job.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that the IRS does have that criminal division, and they are armed, and that was in the news recently too. Yeah, they were because they were laying off a lot of regular ones to bring on more criminal investigator divisions that are armed.
Yeah, they're an interesting organization. Like I'll tell you this, like when I worked on a DEA task force, you would go into a room, and again, this isn't like dime bag stuff, and we're talking like kilos coming across because it's like right at the border. So this is wholesale. It's like the Sam's Club of drugs, right? And when you would go and bring in let's say you took down a stash house, you did something, you bring the guy in, you're sitting down to interview him. You would have like, the DEA agent, maybe the TFO, the task force officers working with him from the local PD. And then they would always bring in like an IRS guy who was going to kind of go over the books with the guy. And that's who terrified, the traffickers the most, because that's the guy who like has all the information about every shady thing they've done. Like they'd be like tough with like the TFO, or they'd be like, yeah, whatever, man. Like the DEA, like IRS sits down, the guys start to melt because the IRS guys like going through their bank accounts, going through their statements, going through their money. And that's when things get real. And so those guys are like legitimate, like very, very smart. A lot of them have accounting degrees. They're CPAs. They have that background, and then they get into law enforcement. So, a lot of them are going to like look like a CPA, but they're like legitimate, like incredible financial crimes investigators.
And it's that easy to detect just like opening up the books and looking at that information. They can pick up on it that quickly, or is it like months and months before they get to that?
IRS, like their investigations, because they have, it's not as simple as getting a subpoena to get like someone's tax records. There's like whole processes you have to go through. Their cases tend to last longer because there's a lot of like connecting dots, a lot of digging in. So it doesn't happen like overnight. So if you're like being looked at by the IRS, you're probably from a criminal perspective, right? Like not from a civil perspective, not like, oh, this guy like, it needs to be audited, but like somebody who's like doing like a serious money laundering or like wire fraud sort of crime, like that's going to take time. Like if they're going to bring in the IRS, it's probably going to be a 2 to 3 year long investigation, more than likely. Now I've worked with them on shorter cases, on other cases, but if you're like getting into tax records, it's always going to be like that deep and thorough. And they're good. I mean, they don't mess around. So they have one of the longest academies for exactly that reason. They go to that basic, and then they have like they're at FLETC for like, I want to say like 6 or 8 months. It's a long time.
Do you think it's harder for the cartel to flip agents, specifically like Border Patrol now, than it was back then?
I don't know that it's ever that hard. Like the hardest thing, and at the time, so let me put it this way. It's probably harder now because at the time when I came on, we were going through a mass hiring. Post 9/11, they basically doubled the size of Border Patrol. And so there used to be recruitment standards where if you were a Border Patrol agent, or you were from Brownsville, Texas, and you wanted to be a Border Patrol agent, you would go and apply, and if you got the job, they were not going to assign you to Brownsville, Texas. They were going to send you to like San Diego. They were going to send you across the country because it removes that, just the chance that your cousin or your friend, because so many people have people on both sides of the border, and their neighborhood they grew up in is on the border. When something is normal, it becomes normalized, right? So like if it's normal that like, hey, yeah, no, like I grew up with this kid and he's a trafficker, his dad was, his uncle was, whatever. Like you see that on a regular basis, it doesn't shock you the same way. So if you become federal law enforcement, you get on this side of the law, and these guys that you grew up with and buddies are with and like, played soccer with or whatever on that side of the law, like it's a lot easier for you to like let your guard down. And so they would move people around the country to try to eliminate that temptation. And then 9/11 happened, and they had to really heavily increase the number of Border Patrol agents, number of CBP officers, number of special agents, number of TSA, TSA didn't even exist before 9/11. So all that stuff had to happen. And a lot of the standards got loosened. And also when you're pushing that many people through at the same time, you only have so many background investigators. So people are, like my background, it took like a year and a half because there were so many people in the pipeline. It took a long time to get onboarded, but that was quick for that time frame. And so, there's steps that are getting missed. There's things that, there's rugs that aren't being looked under. And the cartel recognized that, and they took advantage of that mass hiring, and they moved a bunch of people into DHS ranks from, basically like, hey, your son's 20 years old. He's not doing anything. He doesn't have a criminal record. Have him apply. Wow. Like that was happening. So it's kind of like that movie, The Departed. I mean, they had an entire network of Border Patrol, of customs officers, like and not just like where I was, where the Gulf Cartel was, but where other cartels were as well. They were all taking advantage of this situation of, we can get some people on the inside. And that serves two purposes, because if you've got an asset, for one, that, if you've got a guy who's a dog handler working at the port of entry who's pulling his dog off of, your dope that's coming through, but you can tip him off to your rival's dope loads coming through, and dog's going to hit on those. And then that guy looks like a great agent. So it's providing him some cover. So you've got a great asset right there. But then if you ever get arrested and you're his handler, you've been paying him, you've got an incredible get out of jail free card, right? Not necessarily get out of jail free, but reduce your sentence card, because I've got this asset I can dangle in front of the feds and say, hey, you want some information? I've been paying this guy for years. In fact, I've got all the books, I've got the receipts. In fact, if you want me to pay him right now, because this guy's sitting in front of you, nobody knows he's been arrested yet. You're doing that initial intake interview. That's when they would turn that asset into an asset for them on the other side. And that was happening a lot. We had, when I first got hired on with our internal affairs, which was known as the Office of Inspector General. That's like government parlance for internal affairs. We had a Gulf cartel. I don't know exactly what where he was in the hierarchy, but he was the nephew of the former head of the Gulf cartel. He got arrested. On the U.S. side, he was using a fake passport. He had a whole separate life happening on the U.S. side. And he started singing immediately. And because his uncle had done the same thing. When his uncle got caught in Mexico and got extradited to the U.S., he started singing. And so it would kind of be like a bumper crop of corruption, right? You'd get notified that this date and time, we're going to run some dope through this guy's lane, and we've been paying him. And, sure enough, it would come through. You'd make your case. You'd work the case. You'd arrest the guy. And then that guy tells you about 2 or 3 other guys that he roped into the conspiracy that were working at the same port of entry. And so you'd kind of clear that out. And then, the next time a cartel guy got caught, you'd, kind of go through that motion again.
And were these assets also exposing who the weak links among them and their own, the other agents were, so that cartel can identify them and then offer them money, the addresses, everything like that?
Yeah, they provide, we would have, that would often happen. You would have one guy on a shift. Let's say let's say you're working at a port of entry that closes at midnight. A lot of them are 24/7, but a lot of them, you're going to have a guy who's just babysitting a bridge. And when I say port of entry, I mean literally the bridge between Mexico and the United States. And so you've got CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection, that work that bridge. And those are the guys in the blue uniforms at the airport. You fly international, or you cross an international boundary, you're going to show them your papers, and they're going to make sure that you have a right to be here, you're a U.S. citizen, or you have a visa, whatever. They have about 40 seconds to make a decision as someone's coming through their lane, whether or not they should secondary that person. If there's anything in that card that sets off suspicions, they're going to send you for a deeper inspection, all that stuff. And those guys, I look at it like baseball. If you're batting 300, you're probably an all-star, right? But that means that you're striking out 7 times. You're getting out 7 out of 10 times. Guys at the port of entry are kind of the same way. If you're getting 3 out of 10 loads that are coming through your lane, you're an all-star. But a lot of these guys, once they get turned, or let's say they've got family in Mexico, they go down to visit family, they're at a bar, and somebody tips off someone from the cartel that, hey, this guy's here, makes an approach, whatever, hey, we know about, you're going through divorce, or we know you've got a Sancho over here, we know whatever. And that guy agrees to move stuff through. It becomes very easy for that guy to, for them to make that guy look like an all-star and protect him while also running dope through his lane. And then they use him as an asset to recruit others and bring people in. So we get these clusters of guys, like I said, a bridge that closed at midnight. A lot of stuff would get moved through the bridge in the half hour before it closed, because you would have guys who would volunteer for a shift to babysit the bridge at night. They'll shut it down, they'll close it down, they'll let the last few cars through, and then they'll run their 8-hour shift basically guarding the bridge. And it's in that half hour before that they're moving stuff through. So if a guy is corrupt, he's looking around at the other guys who are at that bridge. He doesn't want them diming him out, so he cuts them in on the deal. These are guys that have worked his shift. He knows them. He trusts them. He kind of gets to know them a little bit. He figures out what their motivations are. And it's like anything else. Your motivations are going to be typically money, women. It's the same motivations that we all have, right? You've got financial problems, or you desire to have more than you have, or down there, it was very common for people to have, something going on the side, sometimes a whole second family going on, and that would get exploited a lot. And it's classic. You give them an inch and they're going to take a mile. But yeah, they would absolutely recruit others and bring them in, and we would end up getting clusters of guys on the same shift a lot of times. Yeah.
Is Border Patrol under Homeland Security? Is it that tall? So it's not a separate agency; it's all under the one.
Yeah. So Homeland Security is a department. So like, it's got like 26 agencies or 27 agencies, something like that within it, and so the entire like Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, ICE, they're all under that same umbrella.
Now, you said you were in Internal Affairs, and you mentioned Office of the Inspector General. Did that also cover the BOP too? Because I remember seeing that name before.
They had their own office. So BOP is under Department of Justice. Okay. And so they had their own Office of Inspector General that did exactly what you're describing, like investigations of guards and things like that, investigations of like PREA violations, like things that were happening in the jails. DOJ, OIG would look at. They would also look at, like, DOJ has oversight of FBI, ATF, DEA, so they would look at the marshals. They would look at anything that involved fraud, waste, or abuse within that department. And so for me, it was fraud, waste, or abuse within DHS. So that would be like Secret Service, Coast Guard, TSA, Border Patrol, CBP, ICE, HSI, all those were under that umbrella.
Now, since you're an agent for the government, do you think that those investigations of internal affairs are just when it's like the inmate side or a detainee side? Because I had an experience with that where I kind of escalated it out because there was a male prison guard that pretty much touched me inappropriately, and it never really got resolved, and it got pushed under. So I'm curious from the back end what that looks like.
Like when the complaints come in?
Yeah, if it's fair for the inmate or the detainee.
It depends, because like what I'd say is, like in a detention center that I worked in or that I was like attached to, you get like grievance forms every day, right? And a lot of it is like, like, I don't like this or I don't like that, or like, you'd have like one English speaking guy in the dorm with like 49 Spanish speaking guys, and he's like complaining about like, hey, can you like put me in a different place? Like, I don't want to be classified in this place. So you got to like kind of separate out what's real and what isn't. There's a lot of stuff that isn't real. There's a lot of stuff that's just, as I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that's just like complaining because there's boredom, because there's nothing better to do. But that stuff should be taken very, very seriously. Like if you're talking about like, hey, like anything that approaches a PREA violation is like a no-brainer. Because that stuff, like, that does happen. Obviously, you're aware of that. That stuff does happen, and I saw guards taking advantage of that. We prosecuted a guard because there's a power dynamic there, right? And so, like, you can't have a consensual relationship between a guard and a prisoner. There's no such thing as a consensual relationship when you have a power dynamic like that. Like, and we had female, not many, but we had female detainees on the same, campus with all these male detainees. There was maybe like a fifth of the population was female. There's like a couple of dorms. And male guards weren't allowed to be in those dorms, and female guards weren't allowed to be in the male dorms. And but they would find ways where like female inmates would like come on to a guard, and then they would end up like having a relationship, and then they would use that as a means to get some sort of advantage, push their luck with trying to like get their case dismissed or whatever else. And so we arrested guys for that, guards who were full on having sexual relationships with a female detainee, like broom closets, things like that. And you'd approach those guys and be like, do you have any idea, like, how, like, because they're like crying, they're like, oh, it was consensual, and it's like, we're in love. And it's like, no, it is never, ever, ever, ever consensual. There's the power dynamic. It can never be consensual. Sexual abuse of a ward is a major crime. Like you can go to jail for a lot of years. And so like these guys, like you're talking to these guys, you're like, you're looking at rape charges. You understand that? But it was consensual. No, it wasn't. Like it can never be consensual as long as you've got that the keys to the closet that you can lock behind you. How is that ever consensual?
It happens all the time in the BOP.
All the time.
I spent a lot of time in the SHU for various different things, and every SHU I was in or every experience, there would always be someone there under investigation for an inmate staff encounter. Because what they would do is while the investigation is going on, they'd split them up. Yep. So she or he would, well, she, because I was in a male prison, would be forced to work perimeter, and he would be in the SHU. Yeah. And he would sit there for months. Yeah. I mean, and that's awful too, because like you're being like, I mean,
you're being punished when technically you're the victim, right? I mean, like you're
but they blame you too. They can't charge you, but they can penalize you with like shots and taking away good time because you engaged in inappropriate behavior or whatever.
Yeah.
But you won't get charged for that.
Right.
Did you ever dive into like the psychology of these individuals that you would catch? Like what did they all share something in common?
So I worked a lot, like the high level stuff that I did. I guess I should separate it because I did, the internal affairs stuff and the investigations of dirty Border Patrol agents, dirty CBP officers. The psychology of that was largely, it was greed. I mean, if you had to put it down to a single thing, it's money problems, greed, right? And those two things are often married up, right? So it's like these guys are offering me $10,000 cash. Like I got to work X number of hours of overtime. I got to do X, Y, and Z to get that, and the government's going to take their chunk of it when I could just have $10,000 cash just for looking the other way as this dope load comes through. A lot of guys, like, I don't want to say a lot because it's a very, very minute, small percentage of people who will violate their oath of office. Very, very few. And we only catch the dumb ones, right? Like we only catch the ones who are like, like so brazen about it. But a lot of it came down to that. And then a lot of it too, it turned into, there's a substance abuse issue that's associated with it because like we took down, I was part of this, I didn't lead this investigation, but we took down a crew of sheriff's deputies in Hidalgo County, Texas, and it ended up being like 15 guys that got taken down, including the sheriff himself and his son. And they were running like training day. I mean, they were like ripping off dope dealers, selling to other dope dealers. They were, like guarding loads as they went through like Hidalgo County. Like these guys were doing everything. And then they would have all this cash. They didn't know what to do with it. So they're going to Vegas. They're like partying. They're drinking. They start doing coke. They're like buying high-class escorts, like because just the amount of cash they have. And then it becomes an addiction thing because now you're hooked on all of these other things. You got to keep the party going. And so the money like needed to, so they got riskier. They got more dangerous. So it almost always comes down to taking that first step because there's a money issue, because you feel like the government owes you more, like you're working harder and you should have gotten that promotion or whatever else, or you're going through something real tough in your personal life and you need that money to make things right, and I'm just going to do it once. And then ultimately, like once you start getting paid, once the hook is set, like you can't go back because they own you at that point. And then it turns into the guilt and the drugs and the alcohol and all those things. And then you got to feed that monkey. And so it just, that tends to be the psychology. And I've seen guys who I thought were good guys who took advantage of situations and that they never should have taken advantage of. And almost always when you start talking to them about it, comes down to, at the core, some financial issue that they needed to deal with. And they just, tried it one time and then they're hooked,
And then what about on the side where they're actually sleeping with the inmates, that side of it?
That's hard to say. I mean, the guys who like that was, I don't want to like disparage like an entire region of the country. But there is a, like in South Texas, there is a much more permissive culture in terms of like having that like girl on the side, that sort of thing. And I think that feeds into it a little bit. There's a psychological aspect of this isn't a big deal because everybody's got a Sancho, everybody's got something going on the side. And so it almost kind of like that they're not looking at it like I've got like I'm doing something wrong in the jail. It's like I've got a side piece is kind of like the attitude when you would talk to these guys. And it wasn't until you like explain to them like, dude, like this is like a serious federal crime, sexual abuse of a ward. I mean, this is rape. Like you were looking at serious federal time that they're looking at you like, what? Like, like almost like for what? Like I don't understand. And like and I think a lot of that for me, because I was working in a facility where this was a contract facility. And again, the training those guys were getting, and you were in some contract jails, they were getting like 3 weeks of on-the-job training, So like, was anybody, like we would go in and give them integrity briefings and tell them, don't do this, here's why, yada, yada, yada. But like, were they really understanding the consequences of their actions? I don't know, until it's in their face and until they're like getting the cuffs put on. So I think there's some of that as well.
Now, from the corruption aspect, were you able to spot just by, seeing how someone moved around and their behavior that they were dirty, or did you actually have to have someone, whistle blow on it, or an inmate snitch or whoever?
It depends. Like we had, there were people that gave off clear signals, right? Like, I mean, there are guys who are showing up in vehicles they shouldn't be driving. They're doing, like they're living well above their means for what their government salary should be. And I mean, that's like, you can see that stuff from the moon. I mean, like, what like a GS-12 or a GS-13 salary is in the Rio Grande Valley. And that this guy is driving something that, like, he absolutely cannot afford. There was one guy, and he was sentenced, I think he was just sentenced last year, like last September. But so my wife is from the Rio Grande Valley, and her family, they're like ranchers down there. And this guy, he was like a CBP officer, he was a dog handler, and he was getting paid at the port of entry to like pull his dog off of loads. And he had been on everybody's radar for a long time, but because the cartel like was doing him a solid and setting him up with some stuff to hit too, it was really hard to nail him because he looked like a really good officer. But everything that we had on him was that he was moving dope through, and he was using his dog to let it through. He drove up to my wife's uncle's ranch one time where he had a horse. He offered him $10,000 for the horse, cash. And like, my uncle knew what he did, or my wife's uncle knew what he did, and he knew what I did. He like told me about it. He's like, "Hey, you know this guy?" I'm like, "Yeah, I know that guy." He's like, "Hey, he just offered me $10,000 cash for a horse. How's he got that kind of money?" I'm like, "That's a good question," So like that sort of stuff. I mean, like, guys were like throwing cash around the way that they shouldn't. And very few people you're going to find are like, when they're corrupt like that, are like sticking in a 401k or something. They're spending what's coming in because they look at it as like found money, right? It's not part of their budget. It's part of like, here today, gone tomorrow. So a lot of those guys get stupid.
Yeah, they say the flashy drug dealers are the ones that, or I interview so many drug dealers, and they always say it's like the flashiness that can, and living that lifestyle that gets them caught quickly.
I had a partner, like, we would be out doing surveillance when I was with DEA, and we'd be like in a bad neighborhood. Like, there's like neighborhoods in deep South Texas that are like, I mean, it's like everybody in that neighborhood is doing something cartel related or doing something trafficking related. As you roll in there and like, you'd set up and do a surveillance in a stash house or whatever, and you'd just see the traffic coming and going, and you're just like, this guy's just like advertising as a drug dealer. It's just like, he's got the rims, he's got the like Gothic script on the back, he's got, the brand new car that like, the brand new Ford Explorer when they changed the body style, and he's got it all, murdered out and everything. You're like in this neighborhood where like literally like, like barefoot children and dogs are running around. It's like a impoverished neighborhood, and you're rolling in here with that thing. And like, you don't think everybody knows what you do? Like, it's the middle of the day on a Tuesday, and you're like not in a suit and tie. I mean, like, it's not hard to like figure out when somebody, like, it's not like The Wire, right? It's not like, like there's not a lot of Stringer Bells out there who are like going to like night class and like learning how to invest in real estate or whatever with it. They're going to like put it out there. Like, I got money, I'm showing it off. And unfortunately, a lot of the corrupt agents, they act that same way.
Now, you were mentioning that he was a dog handler, that guy that tried to buy the horse. Is it possible to corrupt a dog? Or are they already so well trained when the handler gets it?
No, and I didn't go through dog school, but there's like a whole, for like CBP and like Border Patrol, there's like a whole academy for that. And like, you go with your dog and you learn to use the dog. So like the dog and the dog handler know each other and understand each other in a way that like you or I wouldn't recognize what it's alerting on or how it's alerting or why. Like, it's often very subtle when a dog alerts. Like, the things that you think a dog does when it alerts, like from the movies or whatever, like the barking and all that stuff, it's not typically how it is. Like, it might just be the dog sits, or it might just be the way the dog looks at the handler. It gives them the hint that they found something, that they're looking for the reward. Give me my, like chew toy or whatever it is I get when I find something. So the handler knows the dog better than anyone. So it's a lot easier for the handler to, recognize those subtleties or to ignore those subtleties. And I think that's what happens a lot of the time is, it's like he just, the dog did its alert and he just pretended he didn't see it, right, and waves it through. So that's more often than not. I don't think you corrupt the dog so much as you ignore the dog.
Okay, yeah, because you see the TSA dogs now with the Homeland Security agents. They are so calm, the dogs, and they don't make a peep.
No, and like, I mean, it depends on the dog. Like, a lot of the dogs that I saw or that I dealt with were Belgian Malinois, more so than like German Shepherds. You see a lot of Malinois. They're incredibly smart dogs, hardworking dogs, high drive. But I have no idea when. Like, I would, I had to drive through the checkpoints too. Like, if I like in the Rio Grande Valley, 100 miles from the border, they have Border Patrol checkpoints set up. So if you ever went down for like spring break in South Padre Island, and or if you went to Maine, if you went to like Holton, Maine, and drove through to Canada, coming back through within 100 miles of the border, you're going to have to go through a Border Patrol checkpoint where it's just a quick immigration check. You roll through, it's like going to a toll booth, and they're like, U.S. citizen? You say, yeah. And unless you're like sitting there like sweating and freaking out, like they're probably not going to secondary you. Most people are like, okay, go. But they have dogs working the line as well. And, you know, I've gotten sent to secondary when I was an agent, and, you know, and I'm like, all right, whatever. And what ended up happening was kind of funny is I was in my government vehicle, but I was plain clothes because I was a special agent. And I got secondaried at a Border Patrol checkpoint. And I hadn't seen what the dog did. It just like, it didn't like freak out. I was kind of expecting like if I'm alerting, the dog's gonna be jumping up and down, pawing at the car, or whatever. It just like sat there. And I got secondaried, and they, got out of the car, and I'm like, hey guys, I'm on duty, I'm armed. And they're like, oh, okay, all right. I'm like, what did the dog alert at? I'm like, you tear my car apart, whatever. And they're like, oh, the dog alerted, is it a bomb dog? Is it a gun dog? What kind of dog? And they're like, oh, he's not cross-trained, he's a drug dog. And I realized, I was like, I had like 6 kilos in my car like 2 days ago because we had what we call sham. So you have like, typically if you're doing like an undercover, like you might have like X number of real stuff, but the rest of it's not real, and you're like, using it for your operation. I had like delivered dope to like an operation in that car a few days before. And whatever it had been in the car, and the dog like alerted and sat, and so it was enough. There was like no residue or anything, but he was sensitive enough to it that these like taped up kilos that had been in my car for a legitimate like work purpose he was still sensitive enough to it that he alerted. But I couldn't have told you what the alert was. I mean, it was like he just sat and looked at his guy.
So if you weren't an agent and that was a regular person, would they detain that person just for suspicion that they're, moving things across?
They would have, like at a Border Patrol checkpoint, they would have they would call secondary. They would have sent the vehicle to secondary, and then they would have like scoped it. They would have tore it apart. They would have done, if the dog was alerting on it, they would have tore that car apart looking for whatever they were alerting on. And so, yeah. That's where I tell people, I'm like, hey, listen, like, so CBD is like legal in Texas now. It's legal in most states, right? Because of the Farm Bill. But like if you've got one of those vape pens that has like THC oil in it, and you go through a checkpoint, like a dog's going to alert on that. You're going to get, like, you are probably going to get secondary. Like, if a dog is trained for like to smell marijuana, to smell THC, like they're going to alert on that totally legal product. Like you're not going to be arrested, but it's going to inconvenience your day. You're going to be sent to secondary. You're going to sit there while they tear your car apart, while they look at everything. You might even get set in like a detention cell while they're doing all that. So yeah, it happens at like spring breakers all the time. This is like kids from like Austin or Houston drive down to South Padre Island for spring break, and they like come back, and somebody's got like a dime bag in the car or something like that, and it's like, that's a bad day, like because the dog alerted, and now it's like, well, all right. So
can they untrain these dogs, or how will that just get phased out as the dogs get older and new dogs get brought in
like
for marijuana?
The work life of a dog is it's pretty short, right? But a lot of them are like cross-trained. Like some of them are trained to do bombs or ammunition or whatever else. Others are trained for dope. Some are cross-trained. I got some buddies that did that were like dog handlers, dog trainers. They would know better than I would. But I do know that the work life is pretty short. So like they cycle through pretty quickly. A dog's life might be whatever it is, 10 or 12 years, but their work life might be, 3 or 4 or something like that, because the amount of time that they spend, sucking gas fumes and being out in the hot and doing all of that stuff, it wears them down. So they retire pretty young.
Now, the border's such a hot topic right now. Do you think that the border's more secure now than it was before?
God, no.
And why do you think that is, even with technology advancements and everything?
Because we got the vacancy sign turned on. I mean, it doesn't matter what the technology is if you're not doing the fundamental thing that you need to do to dissuade people from coming across, which is have consequences for that action, right? Like look at San Francisco, for instance. Like they have literal signs posted about like shoplifting. Amount of shoplifting must be under $900. Like, what do you think people are going to do? They're going to stop shoplifting? No, they're going to shoplift $899, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to take advantage of what's available to them. Like, if you broadcast to the world that bank robbery was no longer going to be prosecuted, do you think we'd have more or less bank robberies? I mean, it kind of goes with that. Like, we had a very secure border, and 2020 was a different time because obviously the pandemic, but we had a relatively secure border compared to what it is now, where I think the top number of entries we had under the Trump administration was like 50,000 people a month. We've had a dozen months of over 200,000 under Joe Biden, of over 200,000 rather. And you're talking about just overwhelming the system, just flooding the system, because word has gone out that all you have to do is say one word and you're going to get a permiso, you're going to get a notice to appear, you're going to get sent into the interior, never to come back for your court hearing, and that word is asylum, if you just say asylum. And asylum is a very specific thing. In immigration law, you have to, in order to get asylum, you have to meet a very specific, it's like 8 different things that can qualify you for asylum. But effectively, to put it in layman's terms, you need to be persecuted by your own government. And you need to be persecuted because of your race, your religion, your sexuality, like your political affiliation. You have to be persecuted, right? It can't just be like I live in a shitty country that has like a lot of like gang members or whatever. Like it can't be like that. Like that's not a asylum claim. But when we allow people to make asylum claims and we don't test them for credible fear, we don't test them to see that they truly have that fear of persecution of their own government. They just come in and they say, I'm claiming asylum. And then we let them into the country. Everybody and their mother sees that for what it is. It's a backdoor entry to the country. And then we complain that, oh, well, the asylum system is backlogged. We're not going to be able to hear these cases for 8 years. We're just going to cut a bunch of them loose. And that's what's happening. We've had over 350,000 people enter the country, claim asylum, get released into the country, and then DHS drops their cases. And so they're just in the country illegally with no status, and it's essentially a backdoor amnesty. Whereas the way it was done before and the way it should be done according to the law is if you approach the port of entry, or you should approach the port of entry. You shouldn't be going between the ports of entry trying to get around Border Patrol. If you do that, that should be an automatic disqualifier. If you truly have an asylum claim, you're walking up to the first person in the first country that you arrive at that is a government official in a safe country. A lot of these people, they're crossing through 3 or 4 countries to get to our border, and then they're trying to evade apprehension at our border, and only after they get caught at our border do they say, oh, asylum. Now, that should be instantly, okay, fine, you want to claim asylum? According to the law, you're going to be held until that case is adjudicated. You're going to be held in an immigration detention center like the one that I was describing until that case is adjudicated. That might take 8 months. That might take a year. That might take 2 years. Do you still want to claim asylum? No, I'll go back, right? So you don't actually have a credible fear, in other words. So you call their bluff. And that's how it works because they're supposed to be detained. When you remove that incentive, or when you give them an incentive by removing that disincentive, everybody and their mother is saying asylum, 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 asylum. And we're not testing them for credible fear, and we're just letting them into the country. And if you pass through 4 countries to get here, you probably don't need asylum. If you try to evade capture at the border, you probably don't need asylum. If you needed asylum and you were fleeing, say, Colombia because, there's a law against your political party and they're cracking down on your political party and you are going to get murdered, you're going to have your bank accounts closed, whatever the case may be, and you flee, you cross the border into Panama or whatever it is, like that's where you claim asylum. Like I need asylum. I'm fleeing my tyrannical government. You don't walk through the woods for, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, try to evade Border Patrol, and only after you get caught by Border Patrol claim asylum. But that's what we're doing. So yeah, that's the long way to say the system is broken, but it's broken. It's been broken by policy decisions intentionally. The law that existed under the previous administration still exists under this administration. It's the way that the administration chooses to enforce the law or not enforce the law that makes the difference in terms of who's coming across.
So it's not a question of that the border itself is like under security, like people aren't able to sneak past it as easily because you hear about like building the wall, this and that. It gives people the impression that the actual border itself, there's security lapses.
It depends where you are, right? Like the border is, like our northern border is 5,500 miles long, right? And mostly unsecured. It's the world's largest undefended border, longest undefended border. Southern border is like 2,200 miles long. And if you're in San Diego, you might be in an urban environment, right? So a wall or some sort of fencing, and there is fencing and there are walls. Long before, like going back to 2007, the Secure Fence Act was passed, and there were portions of the Rio Grande Valley where I worked have fencing and have walls. So that has existed, but not every section of the border needs that or requires that or should have that. There are parts of like I said, San Diego that's very urban, or El Paso that's very urban. It's very easy for someone, if you don't have some sort of physical barricade or structure in between Mexico and the United States, for somebody to just disappear into the city, right? Versus a place like Arizona, parts of Arizona, it's just desert. Or parts of like West Texas, where it's Big Bend National Park, where it's just mountainous and dry and arid and there's no cities anywhere around. Most people aren't going to be crossing through there. Now they can. And if you're going to cross through there and you have a guide and everything, it's probably because you have something really dangerous you want to bring across, or you are a really dangerous person who doesn't want to get caught. But most people, are going to be dissuaded by some sort of barricade or some sort of technological barricade. And those things do exist and they help. So you're always going to have people coming across the board. It's never going to be 100% secure. You can't have, it's not like, Game of Thrones where you build a giant wall or anything. You can't have like people like guarding it nonstop 24/7 every mile of the border. We just don't have the manpower. We don't have the ability. We don't have there's a lot of places where there's nowhere for Border Patrol agents to live. Like if they're going to work a portion of the border, there's parts of the border where they're like staying in temporary housing at the National Park Service, and they go down for 3 days and then they're off duty, kind of like firemen. You're there and then you're off. Like, how do you recruit people to do that job where there's no Walmart within 4 hours, or so it's hard to staff up a lot of parts of the border. So it's never going to be 100% secure, but you can make it a lot more secure by simply disincentivizing people from coming here, by telling them, if you come here, you're not going to be let into the country. Are you going to spend $10,000, with the cartels to be smuggled into the United States if you don't have a guarantee that you're going to be let into the United States? Probably not. You might stay in your own country. And that's the biggest security apparatus that we have that we're not using, is the laws that exist.
Now, those agents that are placed in like those kind of areas at the border that you were just discussing, that's got to be pretty boring, right? How much action could they even be seeing?
I mean, yeah, like places like Presidio, Texas, like way out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, you'd be surprised. Like if you were in Arizona, you were probably dealing with more criminals than like Deep South Texas. Deep South Texas, it's like a lot of people coming across for economic reasons because it's the closest port of entry or closest part of the U.S. border to the Northern Triangle: Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador. And so a lot of people are coming here for economic reasons, who want to come here to find a better life, to get a job, to do all of that stuff. They're crossing there. People who have criminal records, people who don't want to be caught, are going to those more remote places. So in some ways, yeah, you're going to have a more boring job in some ways, but in other ways, you're going to, that when you are encountering someone, you're probably encountering people who are truly do not want to be caught. So the tracking aspect of the job, the fun stuff that a lot of those guys are really, really good at, that can be very exciting. That can be a very interesting part of the job. And that's happening more in those maybe more remote places where people are trying to avoid being apprehended.
No, they say it's such like a long, treacherous journey. A lot of people come like malnourished, or so are they really a danger when they make it across? If they are able to make it across, are you guys on edge about that, or?
Depends who. I mean, like I can tell you, my first week down there, I had 2 guys from Libya that ended up in front of me. I was sitting and processing. I was like kind of learning how to like intake someone, and so the way it would work is someone would get apprehended. We bring them to like kind of like a jail, almost like you get your in process, you get fingerprinted, enrolled, all that stuff. You create the paperwork for them, and then you figure out where they're going to go while they're waiting for their hearing. And so I was kind of in my first like week or two on the job, I was learning that process. And the guy sits down in front of me, and I assumed, I go down there to the Rio Grande Valley, I'm assuming it's it's all like people from Mexico or whatever coming across to look for work. And it's like 2 guys with Libya, and you're from Libya, and you like start talking to them, and you realize like this guy was caught 2 miles away from this guy. They crossed independent of one another, and this guy had cash on him, $10,000. This guy had $15,000 cash. Who is giving these people cash? Why are they crossing independent of one another? Libya is a country that has strong ties to terrorism. That like all that stuff starts to come through, like, and you realize very quickly when you go down there that the entire world is coming across that border. So yeah, there are people who don't want to be caught. There are people who are dangerous. We had a lot of like MS-13s, a lot of 18th Street who are coming across in large groups of people from El Salvador, people from Honduras who are trying to get in and not, I mean, a lot of those guys are like, I mean, they have face tattoos. It's hard to like avoid, but a lot of those guys, if they just had stuff covered up or whatever, they were trying to like avoid being found out for what they were. And those guys are incredibly dangerous. I worked on flights. We had flight ops kind of like Con Air, and we would take.
I went on Con Air.
Did you? So
I was in Oklahoma City, and that is where you see the movie gang type Mexican, Spanish, face covered. Like those are like straight killer type of people that are in there.
There's some interesting people on those flights, right? Like so the marshals would. So marshals have their own planes, like that's Con Air, right? And then ICE has a fleet of planes that they lease, and I think they have some of their own. And there's coordination between them. But what we would have is like sometimes the marshals would pick up guys and like say Rikers and fly them down to us, and then we put them in our facility, and then we would coordinate flights into El Salvador or Honduras. So I was taking back like whole plane loads of MS-13s into. Like I would work out of our hub in San Antonio for like 3 weeks at a time, and I would fly every single day into Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and it would be a plane full of MS-13s at least once a week. And so you get on that plane, and it's like you and like the pilot and like the flight crew, and it's just like a whole bunch of like just the like most murdery dudes you've ever seen. And most of them haven't been to El Salvador since they were little kids. They came here because of the Civil War in El Salvador, and they grew up in Los Angeles or wherever they grew up, and they're like straight killers. And like I landed in El Salvador one time, and I didn't speak much Spanish, and so you land in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, wherever, and you had a different intake process, right? You're like repatriating these people to their country. So you've got a lot of them don't have passports. They've got like temporary travel documents that were issued by their consulate. And so you get them off the plane, they've got their property, you're doing all that stuff, you're bringing them to where they need to go. And then, you're refueling the plane and getting ready to fly back. And you're flying back pretty much slick. So it's kind of cool. Like you get to fly back in a 737 like it's a private jet, which is kind of neat. It's like you and like the 10 people you're with, including the pilot. So you get to like sit in the jump seat and do all that fun stuff. But I was in El Salvador one time. We landed, we're getting people off. And oftentimes the military would meet the plane. And it would be like kids. I mean, you're talking like teenagers. And they're like, their guns, or they're like flagging everybody with their rifles, and you're just like, hey man. So like I would get off the plane, the first thing I would do is I'd grab like, we had like, coolers full of sodas or whatever on the plane. I would go hand out sodas to all the military that was meeting the plane, because it meant their hands were off their rifle. So it was like, here's a Coca-Cola, man, have this. You need anything? Here you go, bud. And I was doing that one time. This guy who had like the epaulets with the stars on them and all that stuff. I'm like, I haven't seen like a Generalissimo before. Like, what's this guy about? He comes up to our flight nurse and he starts talking to him in English. And our flight nurse like flags me over, because I was like the only representative of DHS. I was like the government representative in El Salvador that day. And he flags me over. He's like, hey, he wants to talk to the Jefe. And I'm like, all right, yeah, I guess that's me. So I start talking to him, and he says, you see all these men getting off the plane? It's all MS-13s. I said, yes, sir. He said, I want you to know these men will never be a problem for you again. And I said, okay, no, I appreciate that. And like the flight nurse is looking at me, and like we both heard this, and he's like, and he turns, he emphasizes it. He goes, what I'm saying is these men will never be a problem for you again. I'm like, understood, sir. Yes, got it. And I like look at the flight nurse. I'm like, all right, I think we're about fueled up. Let's get out of here. And he like, as we're walking back to the plane, he's like, I think he's telling us he's gonna have these guys murdered. I'm like, I think you're right. Let's get on the plane. Like, he's like, why aren't we going to do something? I'm like, it's not our country, man. Like this is El Salvador. We're guests here. Like, he didn't tell me he was going to murder them, but he like told me flat out, like, these men will never be a problem for you again. And at that time, El Salvador was like, they were teetering on the verge of civil war with all the gangs and all the stuff that they were dealing with. So if like a government official with like stars on his shoulders is telling you these guys are never coming back to the U.S., I guarantee it. They're never going to be a problem for you again. Like,
but even if he
read
did,
between the lines,
even if he did tell you that he was going to kill them, you couldn't do anything.
What could I have done?
You just need to get out.
No,
of there.
I got home, like I told you, like the flight ops people back home, like what I had witnessed and seen, just in case that ended up in the news. 130 like MS-13s like lined up on a wall and shot in El Salvador, like probably would have been a blip on the radar for someone. So I reported it up the chain. But like that sort of stuff happened, like it was like, you're dealing with like I deported a murderer to Mexico one time, and like that guy like damn near pissed his pants because he knew what he was in for when he got turned back over. Like we had like the whole SWAT team and everything walked up the bridge, and like this guy, he had killed a cop in Mexico. And so he gets, he fled to the United States. I don't know if he had a visa, how he ended up there, but he gets caught and he gets returned, extradited. And we brought him to the point of the Gateway International Bridge where, you know, the U.S. side, Mexico side, and the Mexican, I think it's like they're called AFI or something, AFI, but they're like all like, you know, done up in their camo with their like balaclavas on and all that stuff, like all like totally armed out. They've got like an armored personnel, I don't know what it is. It's like a machine gun mounted on like an armored truck, like sitting on the bridge. And we brought that guy up and he's like shaking in his boots and he's looking at me, he's like, please no, please no, please no. Like, you know, speaking the limited English he has, I'm like, I can't do anything about this, man. Because he knows what's going to happen. He's going to get over there and he's probably not going to get traditional justice. You know, he's going to get, you know, like these guys from the Mexican Marines or the military, whoever it was, the state police, I don't know who it was, but they meant business. And this guy like understood that they meant business. So, I mean, yeah, he's like that sort of stuff all the time. There's nothing you can do about it. I mean, it's like, I had returned a guy to Germany once. He had done his sentence in the U.S. He'd been ordered deported. We landed in Germany, and the German officials, like, they pulled my partner and I aside at the airport. We're turning him over to them. I'm like, can you guys wait here for a second? I said, sure. They spoke English. And so we're sitting there kind of in the lobby in their, like, immigration processing area. And the guy comes back out to us, and our detainee is sitting there with us. He's like, what's going on? What's going on? He has been in the U.S. for, like, 20 years. He had gotten in trouble. I think he had like an affair with like his 17-year-old babysitter or something. So he had been like charged with like a sexual assault crime, like a rape-related crime, like statutory rape. And he was like kind of expecting we were going to arrive there and he was going to get released. And like he had family still in Germany and they were going to meet him at the airport and kind of set him up with a place to live because he had like lost everything because he had done time in jail in the U.S. and then been ordered deported. And so we're sitting there for like 45 minutes, and finally the German official comes back to us, and he's like, I'm sorry, we had to look and see if he's done enough time. And I was like, no, he did. He did his sentence. He did his sentence in state jail. He got turned over to us. We're deporting him. He's like, no. He's like, we have an equivalent law here, and we need to make sure that he has done an appropriate amount of time for the crime that he was charged with. And so we're going to take him into custody so that he can complete his sentence. And the guy's like looking at me. He's listening to this. He's like looking at me like, what do you mean? I'm like, I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, I don't have any authority here. He's like, you can't let him do this. I'm like, what am I supposed to do? I'm in Germany. You know, like, I don't have a gun. I don't have a bat. I'm like, I'm here to deliver you to them. This is their game at this point. So, you know, that sort of stuff happens, and you kind of end up in these like really awkward situations where you're like, well, go with God, my friend. I'll see you later. You know, hope that works out for you. Because you can't do anything else. Yeah,
when I went on Con Air, I was expecting it to be like the movie Con Air, like with the security, and it wasn't like that. We were all just like on a plane with the marshals. It was a shitty, literally like a duct tape type. There was like tape on the wing plane. Are these planes secure to transport? Because I was sitting next to a guy that killed like 8 people.
Good Lord.
And he was just sitting there handcuffed and shackled. It's not like he was in a separate like cage like in the movie or anything like that. You know, it just didn't feel really secure.
No. Yeah. So to answer that question, yes. Like the flights where I was taking like MS-13s back, like you're talking like a 737 fits, I don't know, maybe 130 people. All of them are cuffed and shackled. And, you know, typically they were coming to us, either we were taking them from ICE custody or they're coming to us from marshal custody. If they're coming from marshal custody, they were getting off the plane. We were basically just exchanging cuffs with them. So the marshals would be like, we need 130 sets of cuffs or whatever to replace the ones we're giving you, right? So we never like took those guys out of their cuffs or shackles. It was just like off one plane onto ours, and then we were taking off and bringing them back to wherever they needed to go because we had the international side of the mission. And those guys were well behaved in large part because you would get on the plane and you would explain to them kind of like the story about the general. Like, you know, like here's the deal. Like you guys are going to be cuffed. You're going to be shackled. It's a 2.5 hour flight, whatever it is, from like San Antonio to San Salvador. When we land there, as far as I'm concerned, you're not my problem. All right, you are being repatriated to your country. You're now a citizen of El Salvador. It's, you know, what they do with you at this point, whether they put you in jail, whether they allow you to walk free, I can't do anything about. What I can tell you, though, is if you cause any problems on this flight, I will let them know that you caused problems on that flight. And I don't think that's going to end well for you. And they understood what that meant. Like, I wasn't like threatening them, like, I'm going to, you know, make sure that I go talk to my general friend over there. But it was like, you know, you're letting them know that, like, hey, like, you are out of American airspace, and because that's what you worry about is like you get out of like U.S. airspace, and they're like, okay, like, is this a free for all, right? Like, can we do what we want now because we're technically out of your custody? And it's like, no, you're going to behave yourselves. If you don't, they're going to hear about it. If you behave yourselves, they're going to hear about that too. So it's up to you what they hear. I'm going to report exactly what's accurate and honest. And I never had a problem on a plane because of that. That was a powerful incentive for them to behave themselves for that 2.5-hour flight.
You know, the trading of the handcuffs that you were just describing brings back a lot of memories because they would literally have those carts. Those
milk carts, right?
And they would exchange them because during transport, I was transported so much, the prison buses and whatnot. They would literally take it from one, put it onto the other one. It was a large process, and that ate up a lot of the time.
That eats up a ton of the time. That, and it's like you're checking everybody, making sure you've got everybody's property, everybody's medication. The flight nurse has to check everything. Like, there's a lot that goes through prisoner transport, and we dealt a lot with the marshals. Just exchanging. Like, they would fly into Brownsville or Harlingen or El Paso or wherever, and then we would meet them there and take their people. And a lot of times we were loading them onto buses if they were Mexican nationals that needed to be taken back across the border, and we would drive the 45 minutes south and get rid of them there. But generally it's secure. Like, I had a couple of guys where the marshals didn't give medications that they needed to give, and they were like freaking out or having trouble. Or like there were times you'd like get to the port of entry and you've got a bus load of guys who are about to get marched across the border. They're about to get sent back to Mexico, and they start rocking the bus or start doing something that's like causing disruption, not because... in large part because they want to stay in the U.S., right? So they're like, if I can cause one last disruption, maybe I'll get sent back to jail. Maybe I'll get pulled off this thing and get sent back to jail in the U.S., and it prolongs me having to go back to what I have to face in Mexico. So you would have that periodically. But by and large, like if I was taking people across to Mexico, like I had guys like they'd look at me and they'd be like, "I'll see you tomorrow, Way." They're just like, "All right, man, job security." Like because they're coming back as soon as they can. So
now, from an inmate's perspective, the marshals that are on the airplane, are these like retired marshals? Because these were all marshals that were completely out of weight. They're overweight. They did not look like
they're not deputies. No.
Yeah, they should not have been in law enforcement from our angle. And this is what we were all talking about on the plane.
No, they're typically not deputies. They have like a sub position that's like a transport officer position, and those guys they're not like law enforcement officers. They don't go to the same academy like the marshals who are doing like warrant service and like, arresting fugitives and all that stuff. That's not them. These guys, a lot of them, they might be, some of them might be prior law enforcement, but for the most part, they're going to be like the equivalent of like a BOP, like guard.
Okay.
High turnover job, difficult job, but low pay. So you're talking like GS7, GS9. And that immigration used to have a job equivalent to that they called a detention enforcement officer. And that's essentially what it is. It's like a transport officer. So for me, like when I was on ICE flights, most of the people that were on my flights were not federal employees at all. They were guys who were like, we'd get like a contract with the local police department. And so it'd be like 10 guys who were off-duty cops would join you for those flights in El Salvador. As long as they could get a passport, like they get an official passport, they'd go with us. And so like that was typically it. But the marshals, you might have like one deputy or one like supervisory deputy on board, and then the rest are like transport staff.
Gotcha. Yeah. Why did you decide to leave internal affairs for that?
So I was in internal affairs for the last 12 years of my career. I actually, when I quote unquote retired, when I left the government, I was still in internal affairs, but I was on the border for about 10 years. And after we made like a couple of large cases, and one involved the sheriff of Hidalgo County, he ends up going to jail for 5 years for corruption. His son goes to jail. His son's still in jail for narcotics trafficking. And, we kind of hit a point where like, the op tempo was pretty high. Like you learn in dog years on the border. Like it's just constant, the corruption, everything else. And like, you get to a point where it's like, I kind of want to do something different that's a little bit less like, running and gunning. And so there's an opportunity to go off the border and go to our San Antonio office. And there was a lot more fraud work to do there, a lot more cases involving telefraud, involving FEMA fraud, involving other types of money laundering and wire fraud stuff. And so I took that opportunity, and then I finished my career off the border. So I stayed with internal affairs, but the internal affairs stuff that I was doing was more money related, and it was more, as my wife calls it, nerd crime. So,
which I didn't even think Homeland Security would cover.
Yeah,
unless it related to like terrorism or something like that.
So what I covered, so FEMA is under Homeland Security, and anytime there's a storm, the government comes in and throws money at it, or COVID.
The
a lot of that money
pandemic
flowed
was
through.
huge.
Yeah, a lot of that money flowed through FEMA, and so all of that stuff, like anytime the government is throwing money out, there's limited accountability, and there's a lot of people who stick their hands out who shouldn't get it. And it's very easy to scam the government, and it's a numbers game. They recognize and understand that like money that gets given out today because of this disaster is probably not going to get looked into for a while, and so you got an opportunity here to take advantage of something, and then you play the numbers game. You recognize that there's only a certain percentage of the people who scam are actually going to get held accountable. And so a lot of like you're kind of like general dirtbag scammers, like kind of like the hot check sort of like stuff, like the people who are doing like the little kind of crimes, they'll take advantage of FEMA as well, and they'll get their like $3,000 or their $5,000 for claiming their apartment got flooded or whatever. And so there's a lot of that stuff that falls under fraud for DHS that we have to look at, and we typically look at higher level stuff like $30,000, $40,000 or more is how you get in the door with the U.S. Attorney's Office. They don't care about the small dollar stuff that can go to the state and local. But I got into looking into telefraud because Indian call centers, the same people who are calling and impersonating the IRS, impersonating Social Security Administration, impersonating Amazon, were impersonating DHS. And they were calling people who are in the U.S. legally on visas, threatening them with deportation if they didn't pay up money. So they would have to go and buy gift cards at Walgreens or whatever and like load $2,000 on them and scratch them off and give the numbers to the people on the phone because they're impersonating DHS. I started getting those reports. And I was like, I think there might be a case to make here. I know this is happening in India, but there's a network of runners here. There's a network of mules who are vacating the proceeds of those scams. And if we can track those people down, maybe we can flip them. Maybe we can name and shame the people in India.
Wow. So. Now, something that I noticed from the pandemic that exploded specifically on social media, and even like my roommates were trying to do this, was there was like these, and it's still popular now, are like these Cash App scams.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what exactly these scams are? Because people would give like their Cash App and then get like $25,000 of like the COVID relief money deposited in. And I never understood how that works.
There's a lot of different scams out there. The COVID, like the Paycheck Protection Program stuff, the the EIDL stuff, which is the economic injury, I forget the D and the L are, something loan, basically COVID relief funds. Paycheck Protection Program, you could get a $10,000 grant. You had to demonstrate that you had a business and that business was impacted by COVID and that you continued to employ people throughout and you could get cash for it. A lot of people early on in the pandemic recognized the loopholes for those things, how they could do it, and then learned how to scam it and then turn that into a business. And so it would be like, hey, I'll take 3% off the top of whatever I get. You file your application through me. I'll file it for you. I know how to make sure you get that money, and then that money's going to come into my bank account, and I'm going to give you all but 10% of it. And so a lot of that Cash App stuff, that flipping, a lot of that was that. It was like the moving and the transferring of the money. A lot of it, too, is advance fee frauds. Pay me X number of dollars for rights to this amount of dollars. So there's a whole bunch of different scams without knowing exactly like what your roommates heard about or whatever. Like it's hard to say exactly which one it was, but Cash App is a vehicle that they like to use.
Why Cash App?
Fast transactions, speed of transactions. Okay. So you can move through the transactions quicker. You can create a whole bunch of different accounts, and it's harder to trace because the good guys have to follow the law, right? We have to issue subpoenas. We have to like go through it. We have to, again, the IRS guys, the accountants, they have to look at line by line. Criminals can move quicker. And so that's pretty much it. It's speed of transactions. It makes it easier. And I think Cash App, I could be wrong, but I think they have a crypto. I think there's crypto functionality too.
And stocks, I think.
And so all of that stuff makes it easier for people like to launder money, to flip money.
It's huge in the feds now too. When I was there, I had no idea what Cash App was, but this was 2016, and everyone said send the money on Cash App.
Huge.
Because a lot of it's untraceable too. Like I was able to set up an account linked to a Boost Mobile prepaid phone, which was untraceable.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and that's essentially what it is. It's like apps like that or gift cards like that. There is a reasonable and real purpose for them, but it also has a functionality that is intended to allow people to do things off the record. And that's not necessarily bad. There's plenty of people who just don't want the government to know what they're doing. It doesn't mean they're doing something illegal. You might buy a gift card and load it with $500 and send your kid to college with it so they have money to, if they need something. But a lot of those, the functionality is just perfect for money laundering. It's perfect for crime. I dealt mostly with gift cards. I dealt less with apps. I dealt less with cryptocurrency. But gift cards, there were like no governors on them. I mean, it was like there were no like red flags, like Green Dot at the time. Like you could go and load up a card, and it's changed now. Like they've, typically once scammers take advantage of something, like the companies respond by putting, checks in their system. somebody gets a phone call and it's like, hey, like you owe $10,000, go buy a couple of gift cards. And it's very quick for them to go pull cash out of the bank, load it onto the gift card. Gift card gets flipped to several other gift cards. And that's essentially what's happening with Cash App, is it's like flipping very quickly from one person to another. So it gets smurfed out into the system. It's harder to trace. And then that money gets, they purchase, say they go take the gift card and they purchase a money order with it. And then they purchase a money order somewhere else. And then they take those money orders and pull them up and put them in different bank accounts. And it just, the volume of transactions that occurs makes it very difficult for law enforcement to trace them, just because each one of those things with a different entity, different subpoena, different wait time. And by the time you get all that information compiled and you figure all that stuff out, they're making 50 other transactions, So it's like you're always kind of playing from behind when you have to play by the rules. And anything that advances an individual's inability or individual's ability to make transactions more quickly and with less information is going to be something that they dive right into and find ways to use.
And now there's all these sites where you can cash a gift card and online convert it into cash.
Yeah, you can convert them into cash. You can sell them. And a lot of there's a lot of different ways that they're using eBay. They're using Craigslist. They're using all these different online. I tell people all the time, Facebook Marketplace, 80% of what's on Facebook Marketplace is a scam.
You can usually tell though.
Yeah, you put your car up for sale and immediately you're getting 30 messages from people asking for the VIN. And don't give, if anybody's listening, don't give them the VIN. Because they're just going to use it to create a dummy ad and then scam somebody else, or they're going to use it to create a dummy registration and then pretend it's their vehicle, all that stuff. There's people who are like, oh, I need to send, can you send me your PayPal, or can you send me whatever so that I can send you $500 to hold this item. And you're like, oh, okay, that sounds like a good deal. But what it really is it ends up being an advance fee fraud, or they're going to ask, oh, can you send this amount back? Or they're going to quote unquote, oversend and then ask you to send it back to them. And there's just a new scam every minute, and certain scams have certain hallmarks. And so you can tell typically government impersonation is typically India-based, your IRS scam, your Social Security scam, your DHS impersonation scam, your FEMA scams, Amazon scams. Those tend to be India call center based. Your lotto scams, your grandson in jail scams, things like that. A lot of that stuff originates in Jamaica, but a lot of it's West African now. A lot of your advance fee frauds are West African, Cameroon, Benin, Nigeria, places like that. A big one that nobody's doing anything about is a puppy scam. Basically, they are creating websites for dog breeders on an industrial scale. And so something like 8 or 9 out of 10 websites that you find online advertising a puppy for sale. Let's say you want to buy a sheepadoodle or whatever. I have a sheepadoodle. So you want to buy a sheepadoodle. You go Google sheepadoodle, Connecticut, and you're 90% of the websites that you find are going to be complete BS. And they're going to show you pictures that they've stolen from another website, and they're going to convince you that the sheepadoodles are in Houston, right? You can pay us X number of dollars to hold one, and then it's an entire advance fee fraud where they're going to ship you the dog, but the dog never arrives because it got stuck at the Atlanta airport and it needs this, to get it out, and it needs veterinary checks and it needs X, Y, and Z, and all these things. You're paying little by little, and over time you end up getting bled dry out of $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 for a dog that doesn't exist and never arrives. And a lot of that is West African. So they all kind of have their hallmarks and their way of doing business. And the one thing that is true throughout is that once we figure out one way of attacking the scam, they pivot, right? So it's just, the method changes from gift card to Cash App, from Cash App to money orders, from money orders back to gift cards. And it's a game of whack-a-mole, basically.
Yeah, and do you think a lot of these low-level scammers can just skate the system because it's the dollar amount and they're doing enough to live off of and they'll never get caught because of just how many there are?
That's part of it. The other part, too, is, and I think this is more of a government thing, a federal thing, but DEA, you seize things, right? You seize drugs, you seize money, you seize guns. There's a tangible thing that you can take and that you can have your photo op, or you can convert that to cash. You can actually pay for your own operations by seizing vehicles and homes and all this stuff. There's something to be said about that. With scammers, most of that money is gone into the banking system, right? I always told my victims, and I had thousands of victims I interviewed, And most of the average age of my victim was 73, so most of my victims were elderly. And I would always tell them, because the first question they have, right, is, can I get my money back? Are you going to be able to recover my money? I'm like, that's gone. I mean, that money, the second you sent it to them, was sent to 15 different bank accounts, and it's been long since gone and processed and turned into whatever it was turned into. You're going to get a lot more justice than you are money. And for federal agents, like, the dollar amount matters. Like, you have to have a high enough threshold to get the U.S. Attorney's Office interested, and you have to have enough compelling victims to get them interested. So if you're just like, small dollar scams, a lot of those guys are going to run those things for a while unless they get a local detective or somebody who's interested in taking that down, because the feds are just going to see it as not worth their time, unfortunately. And also, we're not going to seize anything at the end of the day, right? So we're going to spend a lot of money chasing this person down, a lot of time chasing this person down. At the end of the day, what are we getting out of it for the taxpayers?
Well, that's why I was always interested in my case, because compared to other, Ponzi scheme type cases, my dollar amount was very small. Right. And it's not like I was one of those people that bought cars and assets and put my kids through school or houses.
Right.
There was none of that. It was just bad investments.
Right.
It all lost money, and they still went to trial. No good plea deal, nothing.
You didn't even get offered a plea deal?
I did. It was longer than what I got after trial.
It worked out well then.
Yeah, which normally doesn't.
Not the case. Yeah, normally doesn't work out that way. So that's good.
But the dollar amount was $480,000 compared to like other people that were my age and
relatively small.
Yeah.
Like my big case was a $300 million fraud case. I mean, so you're talking about like, apples and oranges there. But it also depends on where you're at too. That might have been big for the area that you're in, right? And that might have been a big deal for Connecticut. For the District of Connecticut versus like Southern District of Texas, which is one of the hottest districts in the country because of all the immigration stuff, because of all the dope, because of the association with Mexico. So it just depends where you are as well. The U.S. Attorney's Office may have more assets in one place versus another. They may be more interested in certain crimes in one place versus another. So it might have just been your bad luck that you were.
It turned out to be the best thing ever, though.
Yeah, it worked out for you. And probably, if it had gotten to be a higher dollar amount, it wouldn't have worked out so well. So maybe it worked out the timing as well.
Well, yeah, and I also look at these other cases. These individuals never pay back the money. At least mine's an obtainable amount. Like I pay $1,500 a month now, and then when I have lump sums, I pay more. So I'm chipping away at it, and you see that light at the end of the tunnel. But when you see like a Wolf of Wall Street or any of these $100 million, and you said $300 million, people are never getting their money back.
No, and that's $300 million that we know about. Like this case, like I estimate that in that case, so this was the IRS scam. If you ever get a telephone call from someone saying this is the IRS, you owe us money, that scam started in about 2013. We took it, started probably about 2012. We took it down in 2016. And we indicted 56 individuals and 5 entities, 5 call centers in India. About 25 of the people were domestically located, so we were actually able to reach out and touch them and grab them. They were Indian nationals who were operating as money mules in the U.S. Those people all got, I forget how much restitution they got, but it's like shared, right? It's joint and several. I think the phrasing is jointly and severally, but it's shared restitution. And they'll be paying that, pennies on the dollar. But a lot of those people are going to end up getting deported too. So the victims are never going to get made whole. We did seize a certain amount of assets during the takedown. Like some people had bulk gold or silver or whatever that they had converted some of their gains into, and we were able to seize that and convert it. Or we seized, I think, a couple of vehicles. But by and large, that stuff, it was a money laundering scheme that just into the ether because it went into various bank accounts. It was basically a Hawala scheme where they were just moving money 4 people in India, 2 people in the U.S. And so there was nothing to seize at the end of the day. And that $300 million was probably a drop in the bucket because maybe 10% of victims actually report when they get scammed. Because if you're getting scammed for $10,000 or $15,000 and you're an elderly person, do you really want to tell your kids that you lost that? A lot of them were so ashamed and embarrassed that they wouldn't talk about it. A lot of them were so convinced by the scammers that they were doing the right thing that they still didn't believe they'd actually been scammed. They thought they were helping the government. So when I say $300 million, that's $300 million that we know about from the 15,000 or so victims we spoke to. It was probably boatloads more than that. And at the end of it, the good thing is we did get some justice out of it because 2 of probably the highest level domestic target is doing 20 years BOP. And then the highest level, kind of the guy who originated, the guy who started the IRS scam, who designed the whole functionality of if you ever get a call from the quote-unquote IRS and paid them money over the phone, I arrested the guy who did that, who created that. After we arrested everyone in the U.S., after we indicted, arrested, everybody pled out, all of them. They got about 200 years in jail, all total, these 24 guys. One other guy, who's kind of the godfather of the scam in India, he gets named in the indictment, along with like 30 other people in India. And the Indian officials over there start going around asking for, they're not going to turn these people over to us. They're not going to actually extradite them, but they're going to bleed them dry. They're going to go and like shake him down. And so this guy starts losing money. He's got to pay the bribes. He's got to keep the cops off of him because he's been named in our indictment. And he realizes like, I should probably get my money out of India. So he goes over to Singapore and he opens up some bank accounts. And the Singapore authorities Interpol has a red notice on this guy. They know he's flown into Singapore. They let us know. And he turned around real quick, so we didn't have a chance to go get him, which was a pain in the ass. We were like, God, we're never going to touch this guy, right? He came into Singapore. He opened up some bank accounts. He left. If he never comes back to Singapore, that's it. We missed our chance. Well, 6 months later, he did come back. He came to open up some crypto accounts. And Singapore authorities told us when he landed, and we were able to have them grab him and hold him. And we did the first extradition under the UN Treaty Against Organized Crime on that guy. We were able to get him held by the Singapore authorities. We were able to argue in front of the Singapore court system that he needed to be extradited to the U.S. to face justice. And then my partners and I actually flew over into Singapore, arrested him at the jail in Singapore, and then brought him back to the U.S., and he's doing 20 years in BOP now.
Wow.
So
was that your last big official case?
Yeah, I had about like 14 or 15 other arrests after that were kind of like similarly situated, but that was probably the biggest thing I ever did in my career. And, I left because the Department of Justice turned it into a podcast. They made a big like 10-part podcast called Chameleon Scam Likely, which is a pretty good listen. It was like a top 10 podcast in 2022 that Sony put out through the Department of Justice and Campside Media. And I'm in it. I'm kind of like the main character for the good guys, I guess. And after that, it was just the timing worked out where it was like, okay, I'm never going to do anything in my career that's better than what I've already done. Like this is kind of like the career case that you spent years working on. And then, the timing just so happened to be that my father-in-law got sick with cancer. We knew he had 18 months or so to live. And, it was an opportunity for me to go and be home with my kids so my wife could spend more time with her dad. So the timing worked out really well, but it was kind of nice it was like kind of, walking off like, after hitting a home run a little bit in some ways, because I had this great case, he got sentenced in 2020. I left in 2022, so I ran out the clock on a few other cases that I worked, but that was pretty much the kind of the one where you knock that one over the wall and you're like, I'm never going to hit one like that again. So,
do you ever wish you stayed because it was such a big part of your life to do that every day, live it, breathe it, blood, sweat, and tears, and now it's a change.
It is a change. I enjoy being in entrepreneurship. My wife, while I was doing that, while I was grinding for 15 years with the federal government and doing casework and getting up early in the morning, kicking doors in and all that stuff, she was building a business and built an incredible business. And so I had the opportunity to go and work in her business, and I enjoyed that very much too. But having casework's fun. I loved it and I loved the fraud stuff. I loved the quote unquote nerd crime because, criminals are smart. Like I always I always had a lot of respect for the people I was investigating. I looked at it as these are very smart people, and they're not necessarily bad people either. Like I think that's the other thing. A lot of guys, you'd be surprised how many guys in my role have respect for, if you're not violent, if you're not, hurting people. And granted, I didn't like that these guys were ripping off the elderly, obviously. But what I will say about that is not a crime in India. The money laundering that we charge them with in the United States doesn't have an equivalent crime in India. So you have to culturally understand that what they're doing, they look at as a business, and they treat it like a business. They're they go to work every day with name tags and with khakis on, and they're running call centers like it's a legitimate business. And so, there is a difference in terms of what the law is. They kind of look at it as if you can't, if a sucker gives up his money, it is what it is. And, we see that as a crime. And so, but I had respect for the work ethic because it was an ingenious scam. And it took a lot of work. So I had a certain amount of respect for them as adversaries. And I looked at it as, if I'm smart enough to outsmart these guys, to figure these guys out, to get to the bottom of this, to identify them, to arrest them, then, then they're worthy adversaries, right? And I think that's the thing I miss the most. Is it's kind of like it's a puzzle, it's a challenge, it's seeing what you're made of and what you're capable of, and can I be 1% smarter than you, and can I figure this out? And the thing I loved the most is, I don't know if you ever proffered or you sat down and did
I did a reverse one.
Okay, so we would run a proffer basically. I would come in, somebody gets arrested and they're not going to talk, whatever. They get their court-appointed attorney. I would have a PowerPoint ready for them, for their attorney. We called that a reverse proffer. We'd invite their attorney to come in and be like, this is what I'm going to show a jury. I'm just giving you a sneak preview of the greatest hits of what your guy did. And I just go through the 10 or 15 slides. And they'd be like, okay, I'll talk to him. And then, of course, the guy would be like, all right, what's the deal? What can we do here? Can I be first to the table? Whatever. And you come in, you sit down with that guy. And my favorite thing was to sit down and actually talk to the guys. Because I'd come in, the first thing I'd do is I'd take my watch off. I'd sit in my pocket because I wanted them to know, the most important person on earth right now to me is you. You were king for a day. I want to hear your story. Tell me everything. And they would sit there and talk to me. And I never took a case to trial. Every single case that I had in my career pled out, in large part because I sat down in a respectful tone with these guys and talked to them about what they did. And I was clear with them that look, I don't think you're a bad guy. I'm not sitting here accusing you of being, I know why you did what you did. You got kids at home. You're feeding your kids. You live in an impoverished country. This is a difficult way to make a living. There's not easy ways to make a living over there. You did what you did to take care of your family. And when you have those man-to-man conversations with someone and you recognize that this isn't a evil person at their core, they feel bad about what they did. They understand what they did. They're going to come to the table a lot more often, and they're going to versus going in being I stared at a picture of you every day for 2 years, and you're my, you're my white whale, and all of that stuff. You come in there and you start thumping your chest, and guys shut down. But if you come in there and you make them feel like the most important person on earth, and you have a respectful conversation with them, you say, I've got all day to talk to you. The more that you tell me, the better it is for you. And this is your one chance to get it all out. So tell me. And I had guys eating out of my hand. I missed that. I missed that part of it because that to me was it's the big reveal. A lot of times I felt the scene in True Detective when Matthew McConaughey opens up the storage unit and it's all the stuff on the walls and it's oh God, this guy's got crazy, and it's a beautiful mind with the strings and everything. That's what my office looked like a lot of the times. But when that pays off and you're sitting across from the guy that you've been trying to figure out, you can't help but have a certain amount of respect for how ingenious the thing was that he came up with. And then you feel pretty good about yourself for being smart enough to figure it out. And so having that conversation that's probably the part I missed the most, is having those conversations.
That's so interesting because the psychology you're describing is why individuals come on to, say, a show like this to talk about their experience, or they do these Netflix documentaries where the subject will talk about it. Yeah. Because it's their opportunity to share their experience uninterrupted. Yeah. And talk about everything, and it puts them in the spotlight. You
watch American Greed or whatever, and you're like, what are these guys talking about? To me, everyone in America got those calls. Everyone in America got those IRS calls. Nobody thinks that anything gets done. You get these annoying scam calls all the time. And so we took that case down in October of 2016, a week before the presidential election. And unfortunately, the coverage of the presidential election drowned out, a lot of the coverage of the takedown. So people didn't realize or understand the impact that our case had on that network of scammers that was stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from Americans. And these guys ran an incredible network for an elongated period of time, and they've adjusted and changed, and they're still doing it in different ways, and they've had to adjust to what we did. But yeah, people don't realize or recognize that. So I come on shows like this because I want people in the general public to know that this stuff does happen, but there are people out there who are going to work really, really hard. They can't guarantee you're going to get your money back, but they will work very, very hard to get you some justice. And I think people need to know that. I was so grateful for DOJ arranging to have that podcast done, that 10-part serial podcast about our case, because I feel like it touched a lot of people. It educated a lot of people how not to become victims. And I think these podcasts do that as well. But also the recognition and understanding of it's not just the federal government. It's not just they're out there just harassing you or being just a lot of there's a lot of stuff in the news that gives federal agents a bad name. I think it's important to celebrate the wins when you're able to take down a network that reached out and touched just about every single American, to go out there and talk about it. And fortunately for me, being separated from the government and the case being over, I can talk about it. There was a lot of great guys that I worked with that are still working for the government, and I live vicariously through them now. I see the cases they make, and I'm like, good job, guys, keep it up.
Yeah, it's such a different world that now you can have these conversations because years ago you couldn't.
Right.
There weren't platforms where, a former agent who's seen so many things could sit down with even a felon and have these conversations.
No, I was psyched to come on and talk to you because I was like, this is fun because you've lived the other side of what I investigated. I think that's such a neat like dynamic to have a conversation like that. So when I reached out, I was like, this would be a fun one. This would be a great one to talk about.
That's what I think makes my show unique. And I'm open to all law enforcement. I do prosecutors, lawyers, law enforcement, everything, which I think makes me different from other shows.
Sure.
So I have that variety and aspect to it, which is really cool. And I like to listen, and we could go on for hours and hours about it. Yeah. And you also wrote a book too. I want to make sure it gets plugged in here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I wrote a book. It's called In Valor, 365 Stoic Meditations for First Responders. So throughout my career, throughout my life really, I've loved Stoic philosophy. And for those who don't know, Marcus Aurelius is probably the most famous Stoic philosopher. He was the emperor of Rome 2,000 years ago, most powerful man on earth. And he practiced a philosophy that was all about what's referred to as the dichotomy of control. It's emotional regulation by recognizing what is it within your control and what is outside of your control. And I actually think for people who have done time, for people who have been in prison, for people who are in law enforcement, anybody who's in a fast and certain and rapidly evolving environment, this is an incredible philosophy that is a mental mindset tool for you, because it reminds you every single day that the world can really be divided up into that which you control and that which you do not. And if you focus on those things that are within your control, that are within your purview, your attitude, your actions, your reactions, your effort, you are going to have a much better life than if you were constantly worried and dealing with all the things that are outside your purview. So I wrote a book that's basically, it's 365 days of meditations. It's designed for law enforcement, but anyone can pick it up. Every single day you can pick it up. You're going to get a quote from one of the Stoic philosophers. You're going to get some contextualization. I'm going to take it and turn it into kind of a modern context and use it to explain a situation. And then a journal prompt. So in 2 to 3 minutes a day, you can practice this philosophy and kind of get your mind right before you go out and work. And it helps me a lot. It helped me a lot throughout my career to kind of stay focused and recognize not to let the things that were outside of my control let me down or bother me. And I think for anybody who's listening to this podcast, that's the sort of philosophy that probably would appeal. It's not the beard stroking academic stuff. It's a very lived philosophy that gives you tools to approach your day with what the Greeks call equanimity, greater emotional control and balance.
Is this book allowed in prisons? Because I can really see a lot of inmates reading something like this.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't be. There's nothing in it there's nothing in it that's top secret or anything like that.
I know there's a hit list of books that aren't allowed in prisons.
I mean, I imagine, Ryan Holiday is probably the most famous author right now who's talking about Stoicism, and I imagine his books are allowed in prison. And I actually think it'd be Marcus Aurelius, I believe it was, Nelson Mandela, I think was a practicing Stoic. I believe Marcus Aurelius was an inspiration to him when he spent 30 years in Robben Island in prison. So Epictetus, who is one of the Stoic philosophers, he was a slave. James Stockdale, who's kind of a modern Stoic, he's passed away now, but he was imprisoned in the Hanoi Hilton for 8 years after he was shot down over North Korea during the Vietnam War. He was the highest-ranking military official in the Hanoi Hilton. He was a practicing Stoic. Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, he was a practicing Stoic. He, of course, lost half his family in the Holocaust. He was in, I think he was in Birkenau, but he was in several different detention centers during the Holocaust.
And I read that book.
You read that book, yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's Stoicism. So and if you read that in prison, then my book should be allowed there.
That's why I think this would be, because this is all these types of books they were passing it around in the shoe and solitary.
Same stuff.
These are all in there. I could definitely see a lot of inmates reading this.
It's all about mindset. And Marcus Aurelius wrote a book called Meditations, which if you want to get into Stoicism, that's probably the first place I would go. And Meditations is his journal. It's his personal journal during his almost 20-year reign as emperor. And it's writing to himself how to be a good man, how to do things right, how to have better emotional regulation, how to control the things that you can. So I think if you are listening to this because you are law enforcement or you are a prison guard, like you're going to find stuff in Stoic philosophy that is going to resonate with you. If you are listening to this because you've done time or you're doing time now or you're going to be doing time in the future, you're probably going to find stuff in this that's going to improve your life as well. So I think it's for anyone, but particularly for people who operate in a stressful environment. Yeah.
Well, we'll make sure to put the link to that in the description and the bio. And thank you so much for coming, Kristofor. This was an amazing conversation. I really enjoyed this.
Super fun, man. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.